We're live. Welcome, Local District Central families. Thank you for joining us. We're allowing our participants to come in and people are still joining us. So welcome once again. We'll get started shortly. Muy bienvenidos. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Empezaremos próximamente. Estamos viendo nuestros participantes entrar a nuestra sesión y les damos la bienvenida. We're in for a real treat in the third of our townhouse series for LATINX. And it is our pleasure that we will be having Dr. Brenda Nicolas join us today with our theme being our Indigenous Community, a Diaspora in LA Unified. Ya vamos a comenzar. Muchas gracias por conectar. Hoy tenemos el tercer evento de una serie de LATINX. Y hoy tenemos el placer de tener a la doctora Brenda Nicolas, que va a estar presentando ahora acerca de las comunidades indígenas, la diáspora en el Distrito Unificado de Los Ángeles. Vamos a comenzar. So we're going to get started. And once again, thank you for joining us. Before starting our session, I want to inform you that this town hall will be presented in English and will have simultaneous Spanish translation. To listen to this presentation in Spanish, you would need to click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen and select the language preference for you. You will engage and listen to the presentation in the language you select. Antes de comenzar nuestra sesión, quiero informarles que este foro comunitario se presentará en inglés y tendrá traducción simultánea al español. Para escuchar esta presentación en español, deberá hacer clic en el icono del globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionar el idioma que prefiera. Participará y escuchará la presentación en el idioma que prefiera. Si su dispositivo no admite interpretación, pueden bajar la aplicación Zoom para poder conectarse al servicio de interpretación. So I'd like to review some important points so that we all have an understanding on how to participate during today's session. During this webinar session, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists during the presentation. On your screen, you will see a Q&A icon, and you can type in your questions. At the conclusion of this presentation, we will have our panelists respond to as many questions that we can as time permits. Also, this session is being recorded live on YouTube on our local district central channel. And now we're going to get started. I'd like to introduce Anne-Marie Cauto from School Mental Health. She is a specialist at our local district central. Ms. Cauto, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Arreguin. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. My name is Anne-Marie Gauto, and I'm a specialist with School Mental Health. I just want to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the mental health supports that we have in Local District Central. We know that the pandemic has impacted all of us in different ways, and our health and safety is so important, and that includes our mental health. So we really want to encourage you to seek out support with your mental health and mental wellness. In Local District Central, we have 85 psychiatric social workers that are supporting our students and school communities. In addition, we also have our student and family wellness hotline that our students and families can call for basic needs, support with basic needs, resources, and mental health support. So we encourage you to use our hotline. It's 213-241-3840. And we just encourage all to seek that support that you may need. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and I will pass it on to Ms. Helene Cameron.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Good evening and welcome. My name is Helene Cameron, and I am the Director of Equity for Local District Central. During this third in our series of town halls honoring Latinx Heritage Month, we will turn our focus to our Latinx Indigenous population. Here in Los Angeles Unified, we are home to many diverse Indigenous populations, each with their own unique and beautiful set of traditions, histories, and customs, which help define their cultures. In an effort to shine a light on some of these populations, we are hosting a special guest, Dr. Brenda Nicholas, Zapotec, who will speak to the experiences as a second generation in the diaspora of the Latinx communities within Los Angeles Unified School District. Next slide, please. Here at Local District Central, we celebrate in wellness themes each day of the week. Thank you for joining us on Mindful Monday. There is no acceptance and inclusion without work and purposefulness. And that starts with the mindfulness of ourselves and of others. During this presentation, I'm going to work to be mindful of not only myself, but of the unique challenges and experiences that Indigenous cultures have within the larger Latinx community. Next slide, please. We also follow the 7 norms of collaboration for equitable participation of all guests and facilitators in our town halls. And during this town hall, we will be putting ideas on the table and paying attention to what we say and to others. Though we may not all agree on issues and how we get there, we are encouraging you to pay attention to the Indigenous populations that are in Local District Central. Next slide, please. This is our agenda for the night. Please take a moment to look it over. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Andre Spicer, one of the directors of instruction here at Local District Central. Andre?
Thank you, Mrs. Cameron. Buenas noches, familias del Distrito Local Central. Bienvenidos. Es un placer de estar aquí con ustedes esta noche. Mi nombre es Andrés Spicer, el administrador de instrucción. Again, I'm Andrés Spicer, one of your administrators of instruction, along with my counterpart and my friend, Mrs. Julie Gonzalez. We are so pleased and excited that you have chosen to join us tonight to learn more and celebrate the rich culture, heritage, and history of the Latinx community. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be with us, and we're grateful. Tonight's topic, our indigenous community, a diaspora in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a beautiful mosaic of people from all over the globe. And tonight, our special guest will highlight all the people within the diaspora. Here in Local District Central, we are committed to advancing and accelerating outcomes for all of our Latinx students, whether they identify as Chicano, Latino, Latinx, specifically indigenous people tonight from South, North, and Central America. We're here for them, uplifting, validating, and affirming the culture. So what are we looking at tonight? We want to have a better understanding of the confluence of different characteristics, cultures, and histories that inform the experiences of our various indigenous Latinx populations here in Los Angeles Unified. I tell you, I'm excited for the dialogue, and I know that you are too. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you the champion for all of our learners in Local District Central. Our superintendent has been mindful and intentional in our work around equity, always showing what we have coined the champion mentality. Superintendent Baez, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spicer. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. Greetings to all of our Local District Central families and welcome to our series of Latino, Latinx town halls. As the leader here of the Home of the Champions, we joyfully disrupt systems and convert schools into mirrors and windows for our students. And so today is a good example of that. We know that in our schools, we have many students who have maintained their native and indigenous language and cultures, and we want to continue to foster that. And this is a way for us to learn more about our students in our community. Our goal is to offer every student in Local District Central a quality education in their neighborhood school through equity, innovation, acceleration, and transformation. We are happy to host today's town hall focusing on the indigenous community and the diaspora in LA Unified. In Local District Central, we are mirrors and windows to the indigenous community, and many of our students have maintained their native roots, and we're learning the best ways to connect and advance their learning and honor their culture and their traditions. So I really thank Dr. Brenda Nicolas, Zapotec from the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca, who is here to share her experience and her knowledge with all of us so we can continue to deepen our practices in our schools and connecting with our indigenous population. In all of our cultures here, as we celebrate the Latino, Latina, Latinx Heritage Month, their roots on indigenous and Mesoamerican and pre-Columbian cultures are really important to us. So when we see artwork of the Aztec and the Mayan communities, it's deep-rooted in knowing that we come from a culture that have built pyramids, who've invented math of their own way before the colonization and the Spaniards arrived to this continent. And so we're happy to learn more about our indigenous roots through this presentation today. And I thank our Board of Education for making it possible for us to have these types of town halls where we can speak about this, our roots, our cultures, so we can be mirrors and windows and connect to our students in a way that matters most for all of our students. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our three board member and representatives who are here in support of these town halls and our speaker series. First, I would like to introduce board representative from Board District 1. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Patrice McKenzie, representing Board District 1, led by Dr. George McKenna III, who is here to bring remarks on his behalf. Thank you, Ms. McKenzie. The floor is yours. And we'll try to get. Oh, there you go.
My name is Patrice Marshall McKenzie, proud to represent District 1, the Office of Dr. George McKenna. We are so excited for us to be here to help you celebrate Latino Latinx Heritage Month. And I'm excited for tonight's speaker because, as we know, the diaspora is vast and all of us have shared identity, culture, practices, customs, etc. And there are a lot of similarities that exist across the globe in terms of things that have been shared and passed on in their traditions. So look forward to learning with you, look forward to supporting your leadership. You have an amazing leadership team in Local District Central, and we look forward to being able to be supportive. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Ms. McKenzie. Thank you for joining us today. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce one of our most recent guest panelists here in our speaker series, our board member, Monica Garcia, who's been leading policy for the past 16 years in the advancement of our students and community, reaching 100% graduation. It is my pleasure to introduce our board representative from Board District 2, Ms. Monica Garcia. Thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. Buenas noches. Good evening, champions. It is an honor to join you as you continue to invite us all to reach our best selves through learning about one another. I'm excited about today's conversation with Dr. Nicolas, and I am going to share with you that LA Unified is home to the largest Indigenous community in the country. Who is surprised? We have so many families living their life, but truly inviting us to restore wellness, peace, and harmony through understanding. So I am here as a learner today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I just have to shout out Local District Central, who keep raising the bar for urban education in Los Angeles. Adelante.
Thank you so much, Ms. Garcia, and thank you for making it possible to have these town halls. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce our board member from Board District 5, Ms. Jackie Goldberg, who prioritizes wellness and community schools for every single school. Thank you for supporting these efforts. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. Behind me, you can see Echo Parque, Echo Park, where I've lived for the last 42 years. And it is a very, very interesting community, but it is unfortunately becoming less interesting. I want to just welcome all 216 of you who've joined us tonight, and to say thank you for being learners, for being people interested in knowing more about just about everything and participating in these events. I know that most of you have worked or gone to school all day. Some of you are getting ready to go to work again at another job tonight, and yet here you are, and we thank you for your interest and your commitment so that all of us can know more about all of the peoples that inhabit our wonderful school district. I also want to thank Aline Cameron and Dr. Baez and all of you, and Dr. Spicer, all of you in LD Central for putting these events on, because I think they are so important. Long ago in the 1980s, this district used to have something known as a Native American Commission. I would like to see us do it again, in which we connected kids from various Native American backgrounds to each other and to services and events, and also use their leadership to tell us more on an ongoing way about their lives and their culture as urban Native Americans. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Nicolas, for spending your time with us. I know that all of us have a great deal to learn. This area, certainly, I know that as a third grader, I think it was, in LA Unified Schools, I studied Yangna Indians. Not enough, just a little bit, but I do remember it very well. I think it is important for our curriculum to represent all of the various cultures that are in our school district, because that is really the wealth of LA Unified. It's our diversity. So thank you all for putting this on, and thank you, Dr. Nicolas, for what you're about to share, and thank you for letting me bring my greetings. Good night.
Thank you very much, Board Member Goldberg, and to all of our board for being here today in support of this learning. Doctora Nicolás, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. y por todo lo que vamos a aprender de usted. Now I pass it back over to Ms. Helene Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Baez. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Brenda Nicolas Zapotec from Sierra Norte of Oaxaca. Dr. Nicolas received her PhD in Chicano and Central American Studies from UCLA. She is currently working on a monograph titled Zapotec Generations and Transcommunalidad Roots from Political, Cultural, to Social Indigenous Practices of Being, which looks at the trans-border and trans-local communal experiences of the Zapotec diaspora in Los Angeles. Specifically, her work is a multi-generational project that analyzes communalidad in Oaxaca brass bands, traditional dances, and hometown associations by Zapotecs from the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca, and how these practices contest US racial logics of Latinidad. Dr. Nicholas has an MA in Chicano Studies from UCLA, an MA in Latin American Studies with a sociological concentration from UC San Diego. She received her BA in Sociology and Latin American Studies from UC Riverside. Dr. Brenda Nicolas is the recipient of several fellowships, including the Ford Foundation Fellowship, the UC Office of the President Award, the UCLA Dissertation Year Fellowship, and a Eugene V. Cota Robles Fellowship, among others. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenda Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I want to first, I hope you don't get too much noise with the rain here and the different noise in the area. I want to go ahead and just prepare my sharing of the slide. And I want to thank, like I mentioned, or didn't mention perhaps, Helen, first of all, for inviting me, for reaching out to me, for being in contact with me, and for inviting me to such an important town hall meeting. I think in a way, I'm a product of LAUSD. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I am Zapotec, from the Sierra Norte or the Sierra Juarez of Oaxaca. And I'm gonna make a small introduction about how my experiences connect growing up as a Zapoteca in LA to my education and my educational experiences before I kind of get into like talking about indigenous diasporas from, for the most part, Oaxaca and Guatemala a bit. I'm just gonna stop sharing for a bit here. So I was born in Los Angeles, California, specifically the Mid-City / Koreatown area in 1984. I am part of the second generation of Zapotecos Oaxaqueños living in LA. My parents are from San Jerónimo, Xochina, and Yasachi El Alto. So both of my parents were part of that first early migration of indigenous Oaxacans to LA in the early 70s. I do want to mention, right, that before that, and I'll mention it a little bit further on as we get through the presentation, that prior to my parents migrating, there was already other, for the most part, Oaxaqueños, Zapotecos, and Mixtecs throughout California. And right, a lot of those experiences, or the experiences that I'm going to talk about for the presentation, are not solely mine, but of many others that grew up with me in LA. I, at the same time, of course, want to be respectful, and I'm critical, right, that of not homogenizing our experiences, not only as Zapotecos, but of course as Guatemaltecos, Maya specifically, right, as they're not necessarily the same. So Let me go ahead and share. So I want to first start by acknowledging that we are on Tonga land. This is the unceded and and we recognize that this is Tonga land and it always has been. We recognize the struggle at the same time for sovereignty and rights of the Native people of LA. As an Indigenous guest in LA, it is important in my work, in the work of many other Indigenous scholars like myself, Oaxaqueños, Maya Guatemaltecos, or Maya from Guatemala, that recognize our unique position as Indigenous diasporas here on Tonga land and the ongoing existence and resistance of the Tonga people, who are actually an recognized, federally recognized tribe in Los Angeles. So as I mentioned, my experiences are many within my community, specifically how I grew up as a Zapoteca, as an Indigenous woman in LA, has everything to do with my research. My experiences are specifically shaped my research and my current project, my book project. I'm a twin sister and all my siblings attended LAUSD. I am the first generation to attend college and to luckily get my university degrees. It wasn't easy, but nonetheless, right, there's multiple challenges that as an inner city school, working class or working poor student, first generation college student, I had to surpass the challenges. My parents being Indigenous and having, for the most part, speaking their native language, which is Zapotec. At the time that they migrated in the 70s, like many other Oaxacan migrants, their Spanish was minimal. And of course, they spoke very little English, didn't know English whatsoever. They learned it years after being in LA. I am a transfer student, so I attended Santa Monica College. I attended Santa Monica College for many reasons. The main reasons, or two of the main reasons, being that I was, my parents were poor, right? They couldn't afford to really send me to a four-year university. And as a result of that, at the same time, I didn't have the grades, honestly, to go into a four-year university like I wanted, which is why I decided to go into Santa Monica College. I spent 3 years, a little bit more than 3 years in Santa Monica College. And from there, pretty much decided to get my graduate degrees. Of course, it didn't happen by itself. It didn't happen in a vacuum, right? At the same time, growing up as a child of immigrants, I went, during People Free Day, right? I didn't have a break necessarily. I went, and this is probably the story of many others, right? I went with my mom to clean houses. She's cleaned houses for all of her life, even now. And my dad, before he passed away, he was a dishwasher in downtown LA. So nonetheless, I think now as an adult, seeing all the challenges, all the struggles, everything that my parents, like many others here, sacrificed to put not only food over the table, but to provide, in a sense, a better living conditions for their children, has, I think, really come full circle in understanding that as an adult now and having my own child with that. So these are some of the images I'm going to show later, but I do want to mention, right, that when we talk about specifically Oaxacans in LA, right, they've been here since the 60s. Many of them are now fourth generation Oaxacans, meaning that these are the great grandchildren the first migrants, the first that got here, right? So Oaxaqueños in Los Angeles span 4 generations now. Many of them have been involved through in their communities, through the Oaxacan brass bands. I think for at least the high schools that have some music bands, like Hamilton High School, LA High, we see a lot of this kind of generation of Oaxaqueño youth emerging in those bands within the schools, but also kind of bringing in what they're learning growing up within their culture, right? As I've interviewed many Oaxaqueños in LA with that experience of, you know, having more than 1 up to 5 Oaxaqueños within a music class and all kind of coming together to sing, to play this music. Very unique for Oaxaqueños. Cultural participation in terms of dancing has also been very central to the identity and belonging of Oaxaqueños in the diaspora, especially for those, particularly for those that can't go because of their undocumented status, but at the same time for those that are able to go because they were born here. And what I really want to kind of do here in this presentation, in this slide specifically, is center these experiences that are multiple experiences within the Oaxacan community. I'm not sure if I should go ahead and just answer people's questions or just wait until the end. I don't know.
And wait until the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. So when we ask, right, when I ask, who are some of the, and feel free to jot down, put them on the chat, right? Who are some of the indigenous peoples from Latin America? Or quiénes son algunos de los pueblos indígenas de América Latina that live here in Los Angeles, specifically, right? I think oftentimes we don't know. It's often this kind of invisibility, right, that we see. Specifically within the labels of Latina, Hispanic, even Chicano, right? But for a lot of indigenous communities migrating from Latin America, or Abya Yala, is it's very visible, at least among ourselves as Latinos or as Mexicans. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so let me see if anyone, see. So this is only a number of, it's not everyone, of course, but for the Maya diaspora, when we talk about Maya diasporas, we talk about specifically Guatemala, but there's also Maya diasporas from Veracruz, from other parts, from Chiapas and other parts of Mexico, as well as Central America. There are 23 indigenous groups within the Maya diaspora: Canjobal, Chortí, Quiché, Achi, Chuk, Totzil, Tetzal, Tojolabal, which are the last 3 at least here are from Chiapas, right? But the diversity even within indigenous peoples is enormous, right? So for example, when we talk about linguistics and linguistically, for Mayas, for example, from one community to another, just like Zapotecos, Mixtecos, Chinantecos, from one pueblo to another are not within the families of languages, right? Like Maya, like Zapoteco, like Mixteco, Chinanteco. Languages aren't homogeneous either, right? Each community practices and speaks different variation or dialect within that language that many times pueblos living less than a mile away can't understand each other. So that geographic linguistic composition within these homelands transfers on to LA as well, right? Where we have people identifying as Zapoteco or Oaxaqueños from a specific region like the Sierra Norte or Los Valles Centrales of Oaxaca. But languages, the languages are so diverse that this is also an important matter in trying to distinguish how within Indigenous communities, it changes drastically as well, right? There's a lot of cultural difference, political difference, and so forth. So, right, when we talk about Indigenous diasporas from Latin America, specifically in Los Angeles, Maya, Zapotecos, Mixtecs, Chinantecs, Mijes, Pipil, Lenca, Afro-Indigenous, and Purépechas from Latin America make up now a large percentage of the diaspora, spanning multiple generations throughout Los Angeles. And, but yet, these groups, right, this diaspora remains largely invisible for many, right? And so I want to kind of talk about first about the Oaxaca geography, because it's very unique in how many of the diaspora comes to identify within LA or Southern California, even California overall. Oaxaca is a state in Mexico, southern Mexico, located in southern Mexico. It is one of 3 states of Mexico that has the largest indigenous population. And at the same time, Oaxaca is one of the poorest states of Mexico. When we talk and look specifically at the unique composition of Oaxaqueños in LA, for the most part, they are from the Sierra Norte, from this region. So for example, many of the students that you all have come from the region of the Sierra Norte, and they come from the Central Valleys region of Oaxaca, and to a lesser extent, from the Papaloapan region and the Mixteca. And these are all different, hold multiple different indigenous groups in each region. The state of Oaxaca is very regional, and it's divided within 8 regions. So I think if you ever come across for Oaxacans and you ask where they're from, many of them will probably be, if they know, right, that they're from a certain region or their Zapotec or Mixteco identity. Oaxacan migration has been coming to LA since the 1960s. It specifically was inhibited by the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964, but predominantly the Oaxaqueño diaspora here in Los Angeles has been here since the 60s, and they've concentrated in areas of Pico Union, Mid-City, South Central LA, downtown LA, Hollywood, and then you have the later migration of a different group of Zapotecs from the Central Valleys going into areas of West LA, East Hollywood, and Santa Monica areas, right? So what caused Oaxacan migration to the US pretty much has to do with not only the recruitment of cheap labor, specifically of indigenous peoples, right, from Oaxaca, as well as from throughout Mexico. But at the same time, the opening of the market, of a neoliberal market of Mexico, and the destabilization of the economy, specifically impacting these indigenous communities from the Sierra Norte and later from the Valles Centrales that were the hardest hit to face these structural economic policies that ended up hurting first indigenous peoples in rural Oaxaca. So when I talk about, right, the Sierra Norte, I guess when we, right, these ideas of what's rural and what's urban, or how we define them, the Sierra Norte is highly a mountainous region, highlands, hours away from the city of Oaxaca. And so many of their ways of life, subsistence, was through farming their own sustenance within the fields and feeding their family from what they harvested. So those were indigenous peoples and small farm workers were the largest hit in the 60s, 70s, even in the 50s, to really kind of have this Oaxacan exodus, not only to Mexico City, but eventually to LA, right? Guatemala, for when we talk about the Maya diaspora in LA, we typically understand it as more recent. Of course, there are exceptions. And for the Maya diaspora specifically, right, that is also invisible within these terms of Latinidad, of Hispano, of Latino. It's very unique in the way that, right, like Salvadorans, like Hondureños, they are, the diaspora began here in Los Angeles fleeing a civil war, right? So it's very different from how Oaxaqueños first migrated to LA. Guatemala, right, facing a Cold War in which the United States funded, right, not just economically, but also with weapons, supported the Civil War in order to fight communism, right? Hard hit indigenous Maya communities, the hardest, right? There was a Maya genocide, a genocide in which for Maya diasporas or for Mayan people, they were hit hard, a lot of, right, epistemologies, a lot of practices as indigenous peoples. And I, of course, don't mean to homogenize these experiences, but for indigenous peoples of the Americas, many of the practices that we carry are communal, or what some may understand as comunalidad, meaning that it's a structure, a political, social, cultural structure in which reciprocity, right, in which different ways that before having currency, we've been practicing, right? So through exchange, through mutual aid. And so all of that was seen by the United States as a form of threat, as a form of having communist ideologies, tendencies. And so the Maya genocide, right, is a reality, a harsh reality for a lot of this Maya Guatemala diaspora in Los Angeles, starting in the 80s, all the way through the 90s. So when we look, for example, at the experiences of Maya, right, along with Zapotecos or indigenous Oaxaqueños in LA, especially when we look specifically at LAUSD, these are very, right, it's not by coincidence that you have many of these groups either coming together or kind of understanding the same experiences of violence, of cultural difference, of political difference, right? Because there's this notion, right, when we talk about violence towards indigenous peoples historically since colonization, right? And we remember, of course, that colonization is still present for us, for indigenous peoples, right? More than 500 years of it, and it happens in multiple ways. But for many of my generation, as a Oaxaqueña Zapoteca scholar, just like other Oaxaqueño scholars, professors, PhDs that are coming up at the same time that I'm coming up within academia. My husband is also a Zapoteco from the Central Valleys of Oaxaca. We have, right, these experiences with other colleagues, other friends who are Mayan scholars, right, who are part of that generation that were forced to flee the genocide, the ongoing violence in Guatemala, right, during this time. So many of us actually grew up and were part of this kind of building new relationships as indigenous diasporas in the LAUSD school system. It was more than anything that we kind of understood that there was some difference, although it wasn't really set in motion in the 90s when I was growing up with this specific diaspora. But I think now we see that a lot more, and we see the connections being built between indigenous Latin American diasporas in the LAUSD system specifically. I do, right, when we talk about the diasporas and migrants, indigenous migrants specifically, in LA, LA is the largest city in the United States with the most indigenous peoples. That is, however, if we consider indigenous peoples from Latin America and the Pacific Islanders, in addition, of course, to American Indians or Native American peoples, especially Native peoples of LA. As I mentioned, right, many of these newer generations of indigenous migrants, the diaspora of Latin America, span 4 generations. Many of them are attending the LAUSD school system and continue multiple forms of cultural, political, and social religious beliefs through their participation in the brass bands, through traditional dances. And this is a way in which they've been taught, right, that we've been taught since little. For some, of course, especially when we talk about diasporas, Maya diasporas, the experiences have been a little bit different. And because my work doesn't really touch on, doesn't really focus on diasporas, Maya diasporas more so than Oaxaqueños, there's been challenges, right? Because of that violence, of that trauma of reliving the experiences in which many of these families fled, right? That many of the younger generations, Maya generations, are either don't really have family members talking about it because it was so violent, it was so traumatic, and to relive those stories, sometimes there's different ways in which that perhaps happens for them at a later time. For Oaxaqueños, not all of them, of course, but right, they either continue on these ties to their ancestral homelands or are reconnecting in the multiple ways, especially as we see now in Los Angeles. So when we think about, for example, what are the challenges Indigenous displaced people face, right? Indigenous peoples displaced, I'm talking about both Maya, Zapotecos, Mixtecos, so forth and so on, that have been displaced by larger structures, neoliberal structures, settler colonialism, right? That white supremacy and different racial policies within the countries that they're fleeing because of this ongoing erasure of Indigenous peoples, not only in their native or in the countries where they're coming from, but also now that they're here in the US. And how is it that Indigenous right, what does the racial hierarchy in Guatemala or Mexico look like? Of course, historically, this comes from the racial caste system or sistema de casta, in which still affects many of us, right? That's ongoing, right? That colonization. I'm gonna go to the next. So when we talk about, for example, discrimination, I myself, right, experienced this throughout my schooling. I think it was the hardest in elementary and middle school, and I still got a little bit of it in high school, right? But these derogatory terms, for the simple fact of looking Indigenous or being from Oaxaca. And so this experience of experiencing racial violence, specifically within the Latino and more so the Mexicano community, really affected not only my identity early on, but has affected many of the Oaxaqueños and even Maya diasporas since attending these schools, in which, of course, because of the structures that we live in the United States, has made us invisible and has made our experiences invisible. In 2012, when I was finishing my MA thesis, there was a ban of banning the term Oaxaquita, which is a derogatory term towards Oaxacans, used mostly by other non-Indigenous mestizo Mexicans, and the term Indito, right, little Indian or little Oaxacan. These are same derogatory terms that my generation, that even the ones before me, like my sister, who's in her 40s, my other fellow Oaxacans who are in their 50s, interviewing all these generations, because my work is multi-generational, and seeing that the diaspora that was raised, that came here as children and are now in their 50s, also experience this violence from non-Indigenous mestizo Mexicans, and Mexicans specifically, right? And that it's ongoing, right? And oftentimes we don't know as teachers, we don't know as administrators, that this is a reality that keeps migrating with people, right? In 2012, the Ventura County School District banned the derogatory term after Oaxacan Indigenous communities organized to ban the term as a result of a Oaxacan student wanting to commit suicide. And these are the experiences that I think many times we aren't able to understand, right? For myself, right, being called these terms, it caused, of course, like many studies now shows, especially studies conducted by Oaxaqueños born and raised in California specifically, right, that those name callings impacted how we saw our identity. At least for us growing in the 80s and 90s, of all the people that I've interviewed, as well as the people that these Oaxacan scholars publishing on this specifically, it created a lot of shame, right? It created shame in us, in an internal way of colonization, right? Of self-hatred, of being shameful for being Indigenous, being Oaxacan specifically, right? And it led many people to harm themselves or wanting to commit suicide because of the ongoing ridicule for the simple fact of looking Indigenous, right? Having these dark skin or darker skin complexions because our parents spoke a different language that was not Spanish, right? And this is, but it's not perfect yet. There's still a lot of work to do, right? A lot of knowledge to be shared. But I think at least from seeing, hearing a lot of the interviews that I've done with the younger generations, and when I mean younger, I mean those in their 20s or those in their teens in high school, there's a different kind of generation happening, right? There's more visibility about these Indigenous diasporas, by some, not by all. But, one of these, I think that kind of hit the bell running now was that children could relate to, was this program on Netflix, City of Ghosts, right? A City of Ghosts talks specifically about the Los Angeles diversity of not just Indigenous diasporas from Latin America, like Zapotecos, but also the Tongva people who are the native people of LA, and the Japanese diaspora in LA, as well as the Black African-American diaspora, the African-American group within LA, right? And how each of these groups relate to one another in multiple ways, but at the same time, of course, that those different forms of invisibility for many that don't see the diversity within each group. So, when we look at the different ways in which Oaxaqueños, in which the Maya diaspora are doing, and also resisting assimilation. And when I mean assimilation, I mean resisting this notion of Latinidad, this notion of mestizaje, this notion of being racialized as Hispanic, Latinos, Chicanos, something that is really foreign to us, right? I also want to highlight, right, that Indigenous communities are resilient, right? That we have resisted more than 500 years and we continue to do so, seen by not only for example, the different art exhibits, the Oaxacan brass bands closing down streets to march along the streets, within, right, celebrating whatever it is, that we dance differently, that we eat differently, that, and of course I don't want to romanticize it, but I do want to highlight the unique differences that are vast within each culture, that despite that, some of us that weren't born or that in our native homelands or that migrated as children, that there are multiple ways in which we connect and we continue to be indigenous, that we continue to, say very proudly that we are indigenous, that we are Zapotec, that we are Maya, that, and that to resist different forms of our elimination, right? That we're still here despite so many years. I do want to switch very quickly to the Latin American. So in 2017, UCLA published the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora, which is part of the Mapping Indigenous Diaspora or Mapping Indigenous LA project. So this is a resource more than anything for educators, for administrators, but also for students, of course, and parents, right? And it highlights the different organizations, the different activities of Maya peoples from Guatemala, and the ways in which we have maintained, in which we have reconnected, in which we have performed our beliefs, our practices in LA, right, that are very unique. At the same time, each story map connects to that specific region in which this community is located. So for example, you have Maya Visión, which is located in the Pico Union area, similarly like Pastoral Maya and La Comunidad Ixim. La Comunidad Ixim specifically for those students that are Maya, this Comunidad Ixim specifically aims to bring the different youth, 1.5, second generation, third generation Mayas into their this youth group. At the same time, right, we highlight, and this project was a long project coming, that as Indigenous communities that are racialized within these Latino Hispanic identities, labels, what does that even mean, right? And why is it even important? It's important for multiple reasons, because oftentimes when we face different state actors, there's been an enormous forms of violence, such as Manuel Jimenez Shum, who was shot and killed by the police, the Rampart police here in LA in 2010, right? And there was a language barrier happening. Police officers were right, signaling in Spanish and commanding him in Spanish to follow right their what they were asking for him to do. Unfortunately, Manuel Jimenez Shum was not a Spanish necessarily monolingual speaker. His main language was Quiche, right? And he was a day laborer. And so these are the experiences, even today, that we see of how Indigenous peoples, despite right, all this cultural participation, the political participation, and the years in which they've done it, this violence is still very real because we're still categorized or seen as Latinos, but right, we don't, that's necessarily not the case, right, for us. And so I invite you all to just check out the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora story maps. It has videos, it has images, it has information of how different Indigenous communities have established themselves throughout LA and the different things in which they're involved, the resources for the younger generations that people like myself, my generation and older, didn't have growing up, right? I was, and I want to play a little bit of how to kind of understand how large these events get. I think we're running out of time. So, right, when we talk and when we see, right, we see young children, we see students that are, of course, LA born and raised. I see family members here with their kids. This is, in a way, everything that they're growing up with that is forming their identity and their connections to the homeland, while at the same time, right, navigating not only the school system here, but multiple different systems in which we are racialized as Latino, Hispanic, right? That is very different. So I want to go ahead and stop sharing that and leave off with some resources for you all. I do want to mention, right, that as of 2017, the LA City Council voted to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. Of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It's happened through multiple forms of organizing from different Indigenous peoples, centering Tongva, of course, and also in allyship with Zapotecs, with Maya, with other Indigenous peoples throughout Los Angeles that make LA's right, a overly Indigenous populated city that we often don't see. And I'll leave you with these resources. It includes documentaries such as Discovering Dominga and El Norte, as well as the different resources in which Indigenous communities themselves have made to address the multiple issues that our Indigenous diasporas face. They're all LA-based organizations and LA-based groups. And so I welcome everyone to check them out on Instagram, check them out on Facebook, and even Twitter. They all also have their websites such as Cielo. Cielo is one of these prominent Oaxacan organizations in LA, really kind of providing interpreters, providing different resources for these Indigenous communities here in LA. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. What an informative presentation. I learned so much by just listening to everything that you had to say, things that I didn't know before. So there's some questions that were in the chat that I'd like to share with you. So one of the first questions, and I think you gave some answers to this, is what organizations can schools partner up with to support our Indigenous families?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, but I think for one, Oaxaqueños here in LA, Cielo, I see really doing that work, really reaching out to community folks, reaching out to students. Students are actually involved within Cielo, both at multiple levels of their education, adolescents and college students. So they've also seen that experience of growing up as Oaxaqueños and LAUSD. There's La Comunidad Ixin, who are also very involved with youth, Maya youth in LA. And so I think that's the other organization that I invite everyone really to check out and see.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what are some specific actions we can take in order to ensure Indigenous and Latinx communities are able to participate in the discussion that shapes our cities?
Some of the discussions, for example, have to do with right, what we call bullying. I think more so than bullying, it's racial violence. Right, and really kind of making sure we make notice of that because of the harm that it brings, life-threatening harms that it brings to the multiple Indigenous diasporas that have faced this throughout. I think for the most part, when we read it and when we read about it, it's always been the experiences of migrants, of Indigenous migrants, for example, working in the fields, but we don't really still hear of that experience of Indigenous youth who have experienced discrimination within the LAUSD school systems from their Mexican and Latino peers specifically, right? And so I think there's that kind of invisibility that needs to, there needs to be a wider discussion on that.
Okay, and another question is, how do we help mitigate monolithic thinking about our Indigenous populations and their experiences in our schools?
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the work, for example, that is happening right now is specifically through Cielo in order to kind of, the Cielo organization to kind of mitigate this monolithic idea, right, that Indigenous peoples either only speak their Indigenous language, right? We're already 4 generations into the diaspora in LA, and many of them actually don't speak their Indigenous language because of this shame caused by this racial violence they experienced as children and as migrants here. But nonetheless, organizations like Cielo, like the Mixteco Indigenous Project in Oxnard, are providing interpreting services to Indigenous peoples in hospitals, in the federal courts, and in other ways throughout the United States, right, to facilitate that representation.
Another question is, within group diversity is as important as between group diversity. How can we better honor and recognize the multiplicity of truths and experiences of our students and families, what they bring with them from their homes and communities?
That's a good question. I don't think there's necessarily one answer to that. But I would see, for example, by really paying attention to their experiences, at the same time, I think not being, I think, cognizant that not everyone wants to talk about their experiences. Some are too traumatic to talk about. Others honestly are trying to reconnect to their Oaxacan or Maya communities because of the violence that early migrants came from, and at the same time experienced once here for not speaking Spanish or for not speaking Spanish correctly or English. So I think, I mean, there's multiple answers to it. I would, having these types of discussions, inviting students from LAUSD that have experienced a lot of what I'm talking about, right? Because of course, right, not only because I have these multiple degrees, does it mean that I'm the expert, but I think for Oaxaqueños, for Maya specifically, we can all be those experts in the ways that we've experienced our Indigenous diaspora here, whether that's violently or whether that's in other ways.
And then one more question is, do you have any suggestions for our students, our school leaders, and our schools to leverage technology in a way to foster unity, collaboration, and partnership in a way we haven't done before?
I think for the Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles project, I know that's a project that other teachers have begun to use in order to center not only Latin American Indigenous voices in LA, but also the native voices of LA, right? The Tongva and other relocated American Indian groups throughout LA. I know that at least for parts of some schools, for the most part in Culver City area, the West LA area, we have built relationships with teachers, some schools there, to bring for example, education on the mission projects, right, that most children are expected to do in 4th grade, and really challenge those projects, right, because they are projects that are violent, that are very, that we experience and are traumatized by even doing things like that, right, because it's these stories don't die, right, whether it happened 500 years ago, 300 or more, but really kind of, I think, putting recognition to the different ways in which we can alter, and instead of, you know, reach out to, you know, I think on Instagram, there's, right, we call it Oaxaca at Twitter or Oaxaca Instagram, but I think the same kind of goes also for Maya Twitter, Maya Instagram, where you have now these Indigenous youth, right, the ones that once were LAUSD students, doing multiple projects, events to put that resilience up front, to make sure that, you know, that they are recognized as Indigenous peoples. And by the way, right, Indigenous Peoples Day is coming October 12th. Sure.
So thank you so much. The information that you presented tonight is so powerful moving forward for us and for us as educators to really understand the different populations that we deal with. Just for me personally, I became very familiar with the Zapotec population last year when I was a principal, and I received a number of the students who did not speak Spanish. So we did have to reach out and get some help. So it's really important that as educators, we are knowledgeable. And I thank you so much for what you've shared with us tonight. And I hope to share that information you've shared with the rest of the educators here in LA Unified. So I'd really like to pass it back to our superintendent right now. Thank you so much again, Mrs. Baez.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Cameron, Mr. Spicer, and the leadership team who made this event possible. Thank you, Doctora Nicolas, for enlightening us and providing us resources and also background. You've given us some key words for us to research and learn more about, and understanding that our Oaxaqueños, Mayan populations that live here in LA experience something very unique, and that they have a recent history of violence, leaving Mexico and migrating to this city, and understanding that that violence is there with them, and that we need to support, but also celebrate all the richness of the culture, the language and traditions that they bring with them. And so we thank you for lifting that. We do have a large population in our local district central schools where we want to connect in a meaningful way. So I thank you for the Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles project. I thank you for Cielo, who we'll tap into. And so thank you to everyone who has participated this evening to hear this presentation, and to continue to support and deepen our knowledge and understanding of the students, so we can continue to be mirrors and windows for all of our students in all of our classrooms. Back to you, Ms. Cameron.
Can we have the slide deck again, please? So I just want to let everyone know that we're going to have our fourth and our final town hall. That will be next Monday, and we are lucky and waiting to hear from Dr. Daniel Solizano from UCLA. And Dr. Solizano is the director of the UC Accord and a professor of social science and comparative education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also a professor in the Chicano Studies Department and Women's Studies. So we can't wait to hear his town hall next Monday, our final town hall for our Latinx Heritage Month. So I want to thank everybody again for coming, and hope you have a wonderful evening. Special thanks to everybody that helped support this presentation, especially Superintendent Baez and our board members who have joined us tonight, and our administrator of instructions, and all of the other people in Local District Central who've helped support us on this journey through our town halls. Again, thank you for coming tonight, and we will see you again next week. Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. We really, really appreciate your time and your effort and your presentation. LDC Championship mentality, we're here, and we thank you all. Good night.